Being a police officer is not for the faint-hearted. Though they often receive criticism for their authority, they're also the first to respond when trouble arises. Behind the badge lies a world of danger, fear, and sometimes the unexplainable. Here are 4 chilling tales from officers who've witnessed the unimaginable. Story 1. The Crack House Nightmare. I served as a cop for 30 years before retiring at 50. By the time I hung up my badge, I thought I'd seen it all: drugs, violence, high-speed chases, you name it. But there was one night that still haunts me to this day, and I can't shake the feeling that something dark followed me home that evening. It started like any other night. My partner, Steve, and I were dispatched to a domestic disturbance call in a suburban neighborhood. The kind of call that typically doesn't lead to much, maybe an argument, a bit of shouting. But the neighbor who called said it sounded like something more, and we were instructed to check it out. We rolled up to the house, a quiet, unassuming 2-story with faded white siding and overgrown grass. The front door was wide open, an odd detail. As soon as we stepped inside, the stench hit us like a physical blow: marijuana mixed with the sharp chemical tang of meth. We both knew what that meant: a drug house, most likely. "Clear?" Steve whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his holster as he scanned the area. "Clear," I replied, though my stomach was in knots. We stepped further into the house, our boots creaking on the wooden floor as we moved cautiously. Upstairs, we found 3 doors, 2 open, 1 shut. The noise had come from the room with the closed door. Steve motioned for me to stay low, then knocked. No response. I turned the doorknob and pushed it open. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated a decomposing body sprawled across the bed. It was a woman, her face twisted in an expression of agony, even in death. Her limbs were contorted unnaturally, her skin a sickly, pale color. Steve flicked the light switch, and I immediately regretted it. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life, revealing more of the grotesque scene. There were signs of a struggle: torn sheets, bloodstains, and bruises all over her exposed skin. The smell was unbearable, a mix of decay and something far worse. Steve began clearing the rest of the room, and I reluctantly turned to check the rest of the house. As I moved down the hallway, my hands trembled. The house felt wrong, like it was alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I reached for the doorknob of a small room near the back. The second I stepped inside, my pulse quickened. It was an old, dank room with no windows. A small cot sat against the far wall. I turned to leave, thinking I'd seen enough. But just as I did, a scream tore through the air. It was Steve. His voice, full of terror, froze me in place. I sprinted back toward him, heart pounding. When I rounded the corner, my eyes locked on him, holding a man at gunpoint. But it wasn't the man that made my blood run cold, it was what was on the floor. A pale, skeletal hand was clutching my ankle. A woman barely clothed, filthy, and clearly drugged out of her mind, was crawling out from under the bed. She was barely human, her eyes wide and crazed as she groped for me. I kicked her away, and Steve yanked her up by the arm, throwing her into cuffs. As we tried to escort her and the man out of the room, the third figure appeared: another man, knife raised high, eyes wild with rage. Without hesitation, Steve fired. The man dropped like a stone, and I could barely breathe as I processed what had just happened. The investigation revealed we had stumbled into a crack house, one where the woman had been killed over a drug debt. The man who had attacked us confessed to her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. That night changed me. Steve, too. He always said we'd done the right thing, eliminating a dangerous threat before it could harm anyone else. But I still hear that scream echoing in my mind. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel the cold grip of that hand on my ankle. Story 2. The Haunted Office Building. One night, we were called out to an old office building. It had been converted into a medical office with a pharmacy attached, but it was still a pretty eerie place. We thought it would be a quick check, just another alarm going off in a place that had been empty for years. When we arrived, the key holder was there to let us in, and the place seemed completely quiet. The alarm company had reported motion on the second floor, so we headed up. The stairs were locked, and the elevator was our only option. The moment we stepped off the elevator, we were engulfed by a suffocating darkness. The hallway stretched long and narrow, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb at the far end. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us. We moved down the hallway, checking the offices as we went. Every door was locked, which seemed normal enough. But when we reached the last door at the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. It was slightly ajar. We entered cautiously, our flashlights sweeping the dusty room. The air was stale, untouched by time. The waiting area was frozen in place, as though the building had simply stopped moving. We cleared the exam rooms one by one, but found nothing. On our way back, though, something caught my eye. The flickering light was no longer at the end of the hall. It was above the elevator. My heart began to race. "That wasn't there before," I whispered to my partner. He looked pale. "Weren't all those doors closed when we checked them?" We turned around to find that every single door we had just passed was now wide open, their contents shrouded in darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. We moved back down the hall, our footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. Just as we reached the waiting area, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Our radios crackled with static, a low hum filling the air. Panic set in. "Let's get out of here," my partner muttered. But as we rushed toward the elevator, something didn't feel right. The key holder had disappeared. We pressed the button, desperate to get to the first floor. But when the doors opened, we were greeted by an empty lobby. No key holder, no staff. I called dispatch to report the oddity, but they told me the real key holder hadn't even arrived yet. The man who'd let us in didn't exist. When the actual key holder showed up, her face went ashen as she listened to our description. "That sounds like Dr. Morgan," she whispered. "But he's been dead for weeks. He killed himself here." The building was empty when we left, but I could feel his presence lingering long after. Every shadow seemed to be watching, waiting, as if the building itself had absorbed the terrible history that had unfolded within its walls. These experiences have stayed with me long after my retirement. People may mock police officers, questioning their motivations or their authority, but they don't understand the darkness we face. We are the ones who confront the horrors most people never see, who step into places where the line between the living and the dead becomes blurred. And sometimes, the worst part is knowing that some things just can't be explained. Story 3. The freak in the convenience store. It started as a routine call, the kind that doesn't even seem worth mentioning when you're getting your briefing. A trespassing report at an old, abandoned convenience store on the outskirts of town. It had been empty for years, with nothing of value left inside. The place had been stripped bare long before I got there. The lights didn't work, and the air smelled stale, like dust and decay. I pulled my squad car up to the front, the tires crunching on the gravel as I killed the engine. It was already late, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The place was silent except for the wind howling through the trees nearby. As I approached the door, I noticed the windows were completely dark, not a single light inside, not even a flicker of movement. The building looked abandoned for sure, but someone had called in. Someone had seen something, or maybe they were just paranoid. I pulled on my flashlight and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating shelves that had been completely emptied. Boxes that once held candy and chips now lay in scattered heaps, and the walls had been stripped of anything remotely valuable. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I made my way down the aisles. I checked the back storage room, the bathrooms, and even the small office at the rear. There was no sign of anyone. No one had been inside for a long time. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a noise from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. Footsteps? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't about to ignore them. I moved cautiously up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The upper floor was just as empty as the rest of the building, save for some old office furniture left behind, now covered in dust. The atmosphere was thick, like something was waiting, but there was nothing. I checked the entire floor, sweeping my flashlight over every inch of the space. When I was sure it was clear, I made my way back down the stairs, planning to leave. But as I reached the front door, I stopped in my tracks. My gut twisted. Through the dirty glass of the second floor window, a woman with long gray hair stood staring down at me. A sick feeling crept up my spine. How had she gotten in? I'd searched the entire building. There was no way she could have gotten past me. I turned and rushed back inside, my flashlight flickering nervously as I scanned the upper floor again. But when I reached the window, there was no one there. The room was empty. My heart raced as I convinced myself it must have been my imagination, a trick of the light, something weird in the shadows. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing. But as I walked back to my car, I saw her again. That woman. She stood at the window, grinning down at me, her smile wide and mocking, as if she had been waiting for me to leave just so she could make her appearance. This time, I didn't hesitate. My instincts kicked in, and I ran back into the building, more determined than ever. I was going to find out who or what was in that store. The thought of her watching me, toying with me, only fueled my fear. I started searching frantically, my flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that froze my blood. The woman wasn't standing by the window anymore. No, she was hanging from the ceiling. Her thin, skeletal frame was clinging to hooks that had been left behind. Her feet pressed against the tiles for support as she looked down at me with unblinking eyes. She was grinning, her face twisted into a grotesque, mocking smile. It wasn't a smile of welcome or curiosity. It was something worse, something primal. A dare, a challenge. She stared at me as if she were daring me to act, daring me to make a move. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move. I was frozen in place, my flashlight shaking in my hands. Then, without warning, she dropped from the ceiling, her body moving in an unnatural way. She hit the floor with a sickening thud, and then, like a predator stalking prey, she darted past me, moving too fast to track, vanishing into the darkness of the night. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, unable to move for a long moment. I couldn't wrap my head around what had just happened. Had she been real? Had it been some kind of hallucination? I didn't know, but I didn't care to find out. I ran out of that place, my mind racing with disbelief. Whatever that woman had been, whatever I had seen, I never wanted to encounter it again. It was no longer just a trespassing call. It was something far darker, something I would never forget. Story 4. The masked cult. It was supposed to be a routine patrol in Floyd County. A quiet night. The kind where nothing much ever happens. At least, that's what I thought when I first saw the movement in the woods. A figure. Fast. Darting between the trees. Instinct told me to pull over and check it out. Maybe it was a trespasser. Maybe someone just lost in the woods. It wasn't anything I hadn't dealt with before. I grabbed my flashlight and radioed in my location. Heading into the woods off Highway 52, I said. Possible suspect in the area. The silence of the night pressed against my ears as I stepped out of the car. The woods were dense here, full of shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, as I crept deeper into the trees, I saw a figure stepping from behind a massive oak. A man, his face obscured by a strange, weathered mask. I called out, my voice carrying through the trees, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, unmoving, staring at me through the eye holes of his mask. "Take it off," I ordered, my hand inching toward my gun. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Then I heard footsteps. 1, 2, 3. A steady rhythm, but they weren't coming from the direction I expected. Another figure emerged from the shadows. This one was holding something, an axe. My heart raced as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't some random trespasser. This was something far worse. And as if the universe had decided to prove it, more figures emerged. Another masked person, and another, until I was surrounded at least 10 masked figures, all armed, all staring at me from behind their disturbing masks. The weight of the gun in my hand felt like a lead weight, my grip shaky, my pulse pounding in my ears. My training kicked in, but so did the fear. I was outnumbered, and the forest felt like it was closing in around me. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then one of them spoke, his voice muffled but laced with an unmistakable menace. "Go away," he said simply. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for my car, calling for backup as I ran. The figures didn't move, didn't chase me. They just watched, silently, their masks unblinking. When backup arrived, the woods were empty. The figures were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. The trees stood silent and still, no trace of the masked cultists left behind. I don't know what I stumbled upon that night, but I can tell you this. I'm certain I encountered something evil, something far beyond anything I had been trained to handle. Whatever twisted ritual they were a part of, I'm glad I got out when I did. If I hadn't been a cop, I'm not sure I'd be telling this story today. Conclusion: policing isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about confronting the unknown, the dangerous, and sometimes the downright horrifying. Officers walk into darkness every day, facing threats that no training can prepare them for. The supernatural, the unexplainable, the terrifying, these are the things that make this job unlike any other. But the question remains, would you have done the same? Would you have stepped into the unknown, confronted the terrifying, and lived to tell the tale? It's not just about courage, it's about survival. And for some, survival means walking away with a story to tell. These officers did just that.